In March 2026, while Beijing's trade negotiators were still packing their bags, Commerce Department officials in Washington quietly began approving export licenses for higher performance chips bound for Chinese customers, chips that the prior policy cycle had placed above the permissible threshold. Two readings of that moment competed immediately. The bullish reading, favored in Beijing's corner, held that Washington's most consequential technology control instrument had just misfired on the hand holding it. The skeptical reading, circulating on Capitol Hill, held that this was tactical maneuvering ahead of trade talks, that the underlying legal architecture remained intact and fully reversible, and that Congress was already preparing a response. The contest this round is not between the two countries. It is Washington versus Washington, and the instrument at the center of it is a Commerce Department regulation designed to close the loophole that had allowed United States-linked foreign subsidiaries to supply restricted chips to Chinese customers without a separate license. That regulation was the sharpest edge of the export control regime. What happened to it in early 2026 is what the evidence actually shows. 3 rounds carry the argument from the specific licenses approved to the suspended enforcement rule that attracted no press conference to the congressional revolt that neither side of the trade talk calendar had fully modeled. The verdict lands on what it means when a country's most consequential industrial policy becomes a bargaining chip inside its own capital. The first round opens with the licenses themselves. The bullish claim is that approving higher performance chip exports to Chinese customers in March 2026 marks a genuine policy reversal. These are not commodity-grade components. They sit above the thresholds the prior administration spent roughly 2 years defending as non-negotiable. And if those thresholds move in practice, the architecture that depends on them moves with them. The counterclaim arrives from the other corner. Approving specific licenses is not the same as changing the rule. Commerce retains discretion over individual applications. Granting some does not signal that the threshold itself has shifted, only that named entities cleared review. The gate was opened for specific visitors, not removed from its hinges. The evidence lands between the two claims, but tilts toward one of them. Reports from the period, including coverage in major trade and technology press, confirm that licenses for chips in a higher performance tier were approved in the days immediately preceding a senior-level bilateral visit. The administration did not announce the approvals as a policy change, which the counterclaim treats as confirming. But congressional reaction tells a different story. Committee chairs from both parties, members with intelligence access, treated the approvals as significant enough to demand formal explanation. Officials do not demand classified briefings over routine licensing decisions. The counterclaim frames the gate as merely ajar. The legislators with the clearest sightlines behaved as if it had swung open. Round to the bullish side, narrowly. The timing and the bipartisan alarm together exceed what the counterclaim can absorb by calling the approvals routine. The second round is about the move no one announced. The regulation designed to close the foreign subsidiary loophole was suspended for a period of roughly 1 year as of early 2026. The bullish claim is that this suspension is the more consequential act precisely because it was made quietly. By pausing the regulation, the administration handed Chinese customers an additional sourcing channel that the rule had been specifically designed to close. A suspension introduced without a press conference is a policy choice, not a technical delay. The counterclaim is direct and not without force. Suspension is not repeal. The legal text of the rule survives. The enforcement clock is paused, not stopped. Administrations suspend regulations pending litigation, compliance review, or negotiating leverage routinely. And when the suspension lapses, the rule re-engages. The loophole is ajar, not removed. Commerce Department documentation and contemporaneous legal filings confirm the suspension. What is absent from the public record is a Federal Register notice or formal statement explaining the rationale as anything other than a temporary measure. Reports suggest the timing aligned with the broader trade talk calendar. Independent legal analysts, cited in trade press coverage, noted that the suspension created immediate and measurable relief for a specific class of Chinese technology procurement, relief that was real in the short term even if temporary in legal status. Round to the skeptics. A suspension with a defined end date is a temporary concession, and the counterclaim holds here. The architecture is intact, But the skeptics earn this round on a point the bullish side will contest immediately. A rule suspended on a one-year clock can be suspended again. The pattern of suspension matters more than the label attached to any single instance of it. The third round is the decisive one, and it belongs to the congressional revolt the administration did not fully price in. The bullish claim here is that the backlash from legislative hawks, members of both parties including those with access to classified export control briefings, is not a sideshow. When elected members with intelligence access treat an executive branch softening of a national security frame policy as a genuine alarm rather than a political talking point, they are signaling that the softening is real enough to trouble people who know what the underlying intelligence says. Theater does not produce bipartisan classified briefing demands. The counterclaim is that congressional opposition is a constant in trade policy. The members objecting loudest are the same members who opposed the administration's tariff negotiations, its agricultural side deals, and virtually every bilateral accommodation. Their objection is structural, aimed at the trade talk framework rather than specifically at the chip concessions. And historically, their bark on executive branch licensing decisions has exceeded their bite. The evidence pushes past the counterclaim. Public statements from at least 2 committee chairs, confirmed in congressional press releases and major news coverage, explicitly called for reinstatement of the suspended rule and demanded classified briefings on the licensing approvals. The unusual element, flagged by several analysts covering export controls, is the bipartisan composition of the objectors. Chip export fights have historically broken along party lines more cleanly. Reports suggest the bipartisan character of this objection reflects a consensus among senior members that the concessions exceeded what trade talk cover could justify. Round to the bullish side, and this is where the structural verdict lands. When a bipartisan cohort with security clearances treats a licensing decision as a genuine alarm, the counterclaim that the framework is intact starts to carry less weight. The framework may be legally intact and politically contested simultaneously, and that political contest is now the actual policy environment that procurement teams on the other side of the Pacific are operating inside. The combination of the one-year suspension and the bipartisan revolt together reveal the administration running 2 simultaneous and incompatible postures: public toughness on technology transfer for the congressional audience and operational softening for the trade talk audience. Those 2 postures cannot coexist indefinitely. One of them is the real policy. The other is the presentation layer. The strongest case for a different verdict deserves a full hearing here, because the dissent is not trivial. The administration has pulled a version of this maneuver before, offered apparent concessions ahead of a summit, absorbed the congressional backlash, then allowed restrictions to snap back once the diplomatic moment passed. The suspension has a defined end date. If it is not renewed, the procurement window closes on schedule. The higher performance licenses approved were for named entities, not a class expansion, meaning the performance threshold is not formally lowered. The congressional revolt, while bipartisan, has not yet produced legislation. Objecting members have demanded briefings, not passed bills. If no bill passes and the suspension lapses, the record would show Washington had a noisy quarter and then resumed its prior course. The dissent also notes what is missing from the bullish case: no independent confirmation that Chinese customers have used the opened window to source meaningful volumes of newly accessible chips. No public data on the ratio of licenses approved to denied in the same period, and no evidence the suspension has been factored into Chinese industrial planning rather than treated as the temporary anomaly it may legally remain. And the physical constraint persists regardless of licensing posture. Equipment choke points, advanced photolithography tooling, and packaging infrastructure remain largely outside the scope of what export approvals address. Chips approved for export are not a domestic production capability transferred. That dissent earns the round already awarded to it, but it mistakes the temporary for the inconsequential. A pattern of suspension, political absorption, and resuspension is itself a new policy environment. Industrial planners on both sides of the Pacific are now pricing an oscillation rather than a stable redline, and that is a structural shift even if no single rule has been permanently repealed. Washington wins the legal argument and loses the strategic one. The regulation closes the foreign subsidiary loophole on paper. The licensing framework remains formally intact, and Congress has the votes and the bipartisan will to object loudly. But the administration has now demonstrated, in a documented and public sequence, that its most aggressive chip control instrument is available as a bargaining token inside a trade talk negotiation, suspendable, re-suspendable, and tied to a diplomatic calendar, rather than a technology threat calendar. China's procurement strategists do not need the rule repealed to benefit from knowing it oscillates. Uncertainty about enforcement is itself a form of relief, and that uncertainty is now the baseline condition rather than the exception. The regulation at the center of this contest entered as the sharpest edge of the export control regime. It exits as evidence of something more important than its own legal text, that the edge gets dulled when the hand holding it is divided against itself. The restriction that was supposed to end the question is now the question. If you think the second round should have gone the other way, that a suspended rule with a defined end date is genuinely temporary, and the skeptics deserve both rounds, make that case in the comments. The dissent left the door open deliberately. And if you want to follow how the suspension clock resolves and what it signals when it does, subscribe and turn on notifications. That verdict is still live.